What happens when a pilot thinks he's protecting the cockpit, but ends up crashing his own career before the plane even leaves the ground? At Houston International Airport, Gate 07 looked like any other. Routine flight, familiar procedures, a confident black woman waiting to board first class. Nothing unusual, until one man in uniform decided she didn't belong. He didn't ask her name, he didn't check her file, he just saw who she was, and assumed who she wasn't. But here's what he didn't know. The woman he blocked from boarding? She was the CEO of the airline, and within minutes, the entire power structure of Stratos Air would flip right there in front of stunned passengers, rolling cameras, and a gate agent who knew exactly who he'd just watched get humiliated. What followed wasn't just a moment of outrage. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Houston International Airport pulsed with quiet urgency. Overhead, gate announcements echoed like distant drum beats, and the soft hum of rolling suitcases filled the terminal. It was late morning at Gate 07, where passengers for Stratos Air Flight 482 were beginning to gather. The flight was headed to New York, full, oversold, and already 10 minutes behind schedule. Among the small crowd stood Elena Brooks. She wore a tailored navy blue coat, elegant but understated, and carried a sleek black satchel tucked neatly under one arm. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a quiet command in the way she stood, like someone accustomed to responsibility but uninterested in spectacle. A few heads turned, not because they recognized her, but because her presence seemed grounded, purposeful. She checked the time. Boarding hadn't started yet. Across the gate, Captain Brent Wallace emerged from the staff corridor, clipboard in hand. His pilot's uniform was impeccable, sharp creases, polished shoes, and that familiar air of practiced authority. To the casual observer, Brent looked every bit the seasoned professional. But just beneath the surface, something in him churned. He spotted Elena almost immediately, and paused. To him, she wasn't just another passenger, she was a disruption. Not because she did anything, but because she didn't look like someone who belonged in seat 1A. Brent didn't recognize her, but that wasn't the problem. The problem, if you asked him, and he'd never admitted aloud, was that she didn't match his image of who flew first class, who held power, who deserved deference. A poised black woman with quiet confidence. To Brent, that felt like a challenge he hadn't signed up for. He looked away, then looked back. Elena stood in the same spot, calm, composed. She didn't fidget, didn't scroll her phone, didn't glance around nervously. Instead, she simply waited as though she already knew exactly where she was going, and that somehow irritated him. He didn't know her name. He didn't know she was flying incognito. And he certainly didn't know that within the hour, she'd have the authority to end his entire career with a single phone call. What he did know, or thought he knew, was this. Something about her made him uneasy. And in Brent Wallace's world, unease was a threat. A few rows behind Alana, a family wrestled with carry-ons. A toddler fussed. An older man in a suit grumbled about the delay. But Brent's gaze didn't shift. His mind was already spinning scenarios. Who was she? A politician's aide? A corporate VIP flying on a comp ticket? Maybe one of those diversity hires the board kept pushing. He turned to the gate desk, where Marcus Reyes, the young gate agent, was checking final paperwork. Brent offered a tight nod, but his eyes darted back toward Elena. The seeds of suspicion had already been planted. What no one at Gate 07 realized, not Marcus, not the passengers, not even Elena herself, was that the next few minutes would set off a chain of events the airline wouldn't soon forget. And for Captain Brent Wallace, this was no longer just another boarding. It was the beginning of his reckoning. There was a time when Brent Wallace was considered a golden boy of Stratos Air, top of his flight school class, commendations from senior captains. He was the kind of pilot they used in brochures. Confident, capable, and clean-cut. Older captains said he was sharp. Younger ones said he was solid. And for nearly a decade, that reputation held steady. Until the culture began to shift. Stratos Air, once a traditionally run airline with familiar faces in all the right positions, had begun embracing something new. Diversity, inclusion, reform. Words Brent had grown to resent, not because he didn't understand them, but because he felt left behind by them. A few months ago, he'd applied for a promotion to Flight Operations Supervisor, a role he believed was practically his by tenure alone. Instead, the position went to Captain Priya Delgado, a younger, highly qualified Latina pilot known for her precision and team leadership. She had fewer total flight hours than Brent, but scored exceptionally in strategy, conflict resolution, and simulation testing. The announcement had stung. Brent congratulated her in person, but behind closed doors, he grumbled to colleagues that the company was checking boxes instead of rewarding true experience. He didn't say it out loud, but everyone knew what he meant. It wasn't the first time he'd suggested that Stratos Air's focus on representation was compromising merit. It was, in his view, a dangerous new era. And today, as he stood near the gate desk at Terminal 07, that resentment hung heavy around his collar like the starched edges of his uniform. His morning had already started on the wrong foot. Late paperwork from ground crew, a missed maintenance memo, and now, this delay. And there she was again, the woman at the center of his unease. Elena Brooks, standing in that same serene posture near the glass windows, watching planes taxi along the runway like she had all the time in the world. Brent didn't know her name, didn't know her title, but in his mind, she was already a problem. He watched as she exchanged a few words with another passenger, nothing loud, just polite, casual, comfortable. That ease unnerved him. Something in her confidence felt earned. And that, to Brent, was the most irritating part of all, because she reminded him of everything he'd started to believe he no longer had. Not control, not stature, not certainty. Instead, Brent saw someone who didn't look like authority, but carried it anyway, and it gnawed at the version of the world he'd always known, a version where pilots like him were promoted, passengers like her didn't challenge norms, and leadership came in familiar packages. So when she stepped forward toward the gate again, first-class boarding pass in hand, Brent wasn't curious. He was calculating. He couldn't have known she was Elena Brooks, the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of Stratos Air, making her first surprise observation flight. And he certainly couldn't have guessed that by the end of the day, the chain of command he so fiercely believed in would come crashing down, starting with him. But that's the thing about uniforms. They hide more than they reveal. And beneath Brent's polished jacket and gold-trimmed epaulets was a man already unraveling. To most, Elena Brooks was simply another well-dressed woman flying first class. She made no announcements, wore no name tag, carried no entourage. Her black satchel bore no corporate logos, and her outfit, flawlessly tailored though it was, spoke of refinement, not extravagance. She had boarded hundreds of flights before, and in her quiet way, she understood something that most CEOs rarely did. Power doesn't always need to be visible. As the first-class boarding call echoed faintly through the terminal, Elena moved forward with calm purpose. Around her, passengers gathered their bags, a few children clutched stuffed toys, and business travelers eyed their phones. Yet Elena's focus never wavered. She stepped up to the gate, offering a soft smile to the young gate agent. "Good morning," she said, handing him her ticket. Marcus Reyes, barely a year into the job, immediately recognized the name on the screen. A flicker of awareness passed over his face. Not alarm, but something closer to awe. He'd been briefed that a senior executive might be flying incognito. No confirmation, no formalities, just instructions to remain professional and discreet. Marcus kept his tone neutral. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Brooks. Looks like you're all set. Seat 1A. But before Elena could take another step, a colder voice sliced through the air. "Hold on." It was Captain Brent Wallace. Standing just behind Marcus, Brent had edged closer when he saw Elena approach. His arms were crossed, jaw tight. To him, there was no mystery to solve, just an assumption to confirm. He nodded toward the ticket. "That's a premium seat. Who issued it?" Marcus blinked, confused. "Sir, it's a confirmed seat. The system shows—" Brent cut him off, eyes still on Elena. "Some of these comp tickets don't get logged properly. We've had issues before." Elena turned slightly, her gaze meeting Brent's for the first time. It wasn't a confrontation, at least not yet. Her voice remained steady, almost kind. "Is there an issue with my ticket, Captain?" Brent didn't answer right away. He was still processing the incongruity, the composure, the lack of apology in her tone. He had expected defensiveness, maybe confusion, but she spoke like someone used to being questioned, and tired of it, and that unsettled him. In his mind, her presence didn't make sense. A black woman, alone, confident, and boarding with first-class credentials, without fanfare or visible justification. His thoughts churned with the same worn-out rationalizations. She was probably someone's guest, maybe a speaker at a DEI event, or worse, a beneficiary of the optics-driven policies he despised. Because surely she couldn't have earned that seat the traditional way. Not someone like her. Marcus shifted uncomfortably beside him. Captain Wallace, everything checks out. The system verified it. Brent ignored him. Instead, he looked back at Elena and asked flatly, "Are you sure you're in the right group?" And there it was. Not a question of logistics. A question of legitimacy. Passengers nearby began to glance up from their phones, sensing a shift in tone. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply inhaled, once, slowly, and responded with a voice that carried both patience and quiet authority. "I'm exactly where I need to be." And with that, something invisible cracked, not loud enough to be heard, but real enough to be felt. Brent Wallace had just taken the first irreversible step toward collapse, and he didn't even know it yet. A subtle tension rippled through the boarding area like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. Passengers paused mid-conversation. Marcus Reyes hesitated with the scanner still in his hand, and Elena Brooks, standing calmly at the threshold of Gate 07, remained perfectly still, except for the slight narrowing of her eyes. Captain Brent Wallace took a step closer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone did the work, precise, pointed, and unmistakably skeptical. "Ma'am, I'm asking again, are you certain this ticket is yours?" Marcus blinked, stunned. "Sir, I've already scanned it. It's valid. She's—" Brent cut him off with a curt gesture. "Marcus, you don't decide who boards this plane. That's my responsibility as the captain." The implication hung there, sharp and deliberate. She didn't belong, not really, not without his approval. Elena turned slightly toward Marcus, offering a look of quiet reassurance. Then back to Brent. Her voice was steady. "Captain Wallace, I've flown dozens of times with Stratos. I'm familiar with boarding procedures. My seat was purchased, confirmed, and checked in without issue." She didn't snap. She didn't argue. She gave him every opportunity to de-escalate, but Brent didn't take it. "There's been too many irregularities lately," he said, more to the crowd than to her. "I'm not risking a disruption at 35,000 feet because someone slipped through a system error." The word "someone" hit like a coded jab. Elena's brows rose slightly, but she said nothing. Marcus, now visibly unsettled, stepped forward. "Captain, respectfully, we've verified her identity. There's no protocol issue here. She's a confirmed passenger." Brent's jaw tightened. "Then security can verify it again." He jabbed a thumb toward the waiting area. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside until we've cleared this up properly." A hush spread. Not anger, not outrage, just confusion, unease. A few passengers exchanged awkward glances. A middle-aged woman in a business suit frowned and whispered something to her colleague. Someone nearby raised a phone, just slightly, as if uncertain whether this moment warranted recording. Elena didn't argue. She didn't protest. She simply nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and stepped back from the gate. Brent folded his arms. To him, this felt like control, like order restored. But then, Elena reached into her satchel, pulled out her phone, and walked a few paces down the corridor. Her steps were calm, her face unreadable, and her voice, when she spoke into the receiver, was barely more than a whisper. "Hi, it's me. We have a situation." She turned her back slightly from the crowd, giving Brent no further satisfaction. Marcus stood frozen, caught between protocol and disbelief. Brent returned to the counter, eyes scanning the terminal as if daring someone to question him. But something in his posture betrayed him. A stiffness in the shoulders, a flicker of doubt behind the eyes. He had crossed a line, and now a call had been made, one he would come to regret. The hallway leading to Gate 07 had fallen eerily quiet. Passengers whispered. Marcus Reyes stood stiff behind the desk, eyes flicking from his screen to the crowd. A few travelers stole glances toward the woman on the phone. Elena Brooks, still composed, still dignified, though the air around her now carried a colder edge. At the far end of this terminal, a figure in a navy blazer appeared, walking quickly but with precision. Dana Whitaker, Stratos Air's regional operations manager, moved like someone who already knew the fire she was about to walk into. She'd been on a video call with HQ when the situation came through. The moment she heard the name Elena Brooks, her heart skipped, not just because of the title, but because of the weight that came with it. CEO. Dana didn't waste time. She reached the gate and approached Elena first. The two women exchanged only a few hushed words, but something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding between leaders. Elena nodded slightly, then stepped back as Dana turned to face Captain Brent Wallace. "Captain Wallace," Dana said, voice calm but edged with steel. "I need to speak with you privately." Brent straightened, brow furrowing. "I was just about to get security to clear things up. That passenger refused to verify." And Dana held up a hand. "No, Captain. That passenger's name is Elena Brooks. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Stratos Air, and she had every right to board this flight without interference." The words struck like lightning. Brent blinked. For a moment his expression didn't change, caught between confusion and denial. But then his face paled, followed by a slow, rising flush of red. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Passengers around them had begun to pick up on the exchange. Phones were out now, some subtly filming, others pretending not to. I wasn't informed," he stammered. "There was no indication." "You didn't need one." Dana's voice never wavered. "You questioned her legitimacy. You refused a verified boarding pass. You escalated needlessly. And now, you're being relieved of duty, effective immediately." Marcus looked up, stunned. A flight attendant near the jet bridge froze mid-step. Brent opened his mouth again, but Dana continued. "You'll be escorted from the gate and replaced on Flight 482. This is no longer a discussion." Brent stood frozen. For the first time that morning, his authority meant nothing. Elena, standing just a few feet away, said nothing. She didn't gloat. She didn't glare. She simply gave Marcus a small nod. "Shall we continue boarding?" she asked gently. Marcus, still processing everything, straightened. "Yes, Ms. Brooks, of course." He stepped aside and Elena passed through the gate, her stride steady, her posture tall. She walked the jet bridge not as a passenger, but as a woman who had just reclaimed the space she'd never lost to begin with. Brent watched her disappear through the door. For a moment, no one moved. Dana turned to him, quietly gesturing toward the terminal exit. His steps were heavier now, measured. And with every footfall, the reality set in. The woman he had tried to block from boarding was not just someone important. She was the very force that signed his paychecks, and now, possibly, the one ending them. The aircraft door sealed with a gentle hiss, and Stratos Air Flight 482 began to taxi away from Gate 07. In Seat 1A, Elena Brooks sat quietly, her seatbelt fastened, a folded leather folio resting on her lap. The first-class cabin bustled with polite service. Flight attendants moving with professional rhythm, passengers settling in, hushed tones of conversation filling the air. But Elena wasn't listening to any of it. Her gaze drifted out the window as the aircraft edged toward the runway. The sky was clear, the afternoon sun casting a warm sheen across the tarmac. Still, her mind wasn't in Houston. It lingered behind. Back at the gate, back at the moment, a uniformed man had tried to deny her place, not because of policy or protocol, but because of bias wrapped in professionalism. And it wasn't new. It never was. She had seen that look before, the double take, the concealed skepticism, the instinctive need to question her legitimacy. But what happened today was different. This time, it hadn't happened in a boardroom or a media panel. It happened in public. It happened while wearing no badge, carrying no title, and asking for no special treatment. And that, perhaps, made it all the more revealing. As the aircraft lifted from the runway and rose steadily into the sky, Elena opened her folio, slid out a sleek tablet, and began typing, methodically, without flair. It wasn't a complaint. It was a reform proposal in progress. She titled it, Operational Blind Spots, Bridging Leadership Culture and Ground Experience. Her notes were clear. Standardized conflict de-escalation training for gate-level staff. Strengthen vetting criteria for cockpit leadership, not just for skill, but for emotional intelligence. Require cross-departmental equity modules, including unconscious bias evaluation. Establish real-time incident reporting protocols when a chain of command is violated. She paused, then typed a single line deliberately. No passenger, regardless of race, gender, or perceived status, should have to prove they belong. She looked up. The flight attendants were moving down the aisle now, offering drinks, soft smiles. She observed closely, tone, body language, eye contact. Elena had never believed in distant leadership. She led by listening, by watching, by walking the same floors as her team. And today, she would watch more carefully than ever. Because this wasn't just about Brent Wallace, it was about the system that enabled someone like him to operate unchallenged until the wrong moment collided with the wrong assumption. Meanwhile, back in Houston, Brent Wallace sat stiffly in a windowless conference room. Across the table sat Dana Whitaker, now with an HR manager and a representative from the pilots' union. His blazer had been removed. His pilot wings were still clipped to his shirt, but they felt heavy, like decorations on a uniform that no longer fit. He was being asked to explain why he had questioned a passenger whose credentials were in order, why he had overridden a verified gate scan, why he had escalated an encounter without cause. Brent kept his answers measured. He spoke of uncertainty, of standard procedures, of ensuring safety. But the air in the room had already shifted, because the people sitting across from him weren't just listening to what he said. They were remembering what they'd seen, and what the world would soon see. Somewhere high above the clouds, Elena Brooks quietly documented the first chapter of a cultural shift she could no longer postpone. And somewhere grounded, Brent Wallace began to understand. This wasn't turbulence. It was a reckoning. By the time Flight 482 began its descent into New York airspace, the story had already taken flight online. It started with a short video, no more than 30 seconds. Grainy, shaky, but unmistakable. It showed a woman in navy blue being stopped at Gate 07, her expression calm, her voice measured. And then it showed a pilot, voice clipped, posture rigid, pointing toward the terminal, telling her to step aside. The caption read, "Pilot blocks black woman from boarding first class. She turns out to be the CEO." The clip spread like wildfire. Passengers who had witnessed the exchange began posting their own recollections. Some uploaded more footage. Others shared quotes. Hashtags trended within hours. Hashtag Gate 07 incident, #Stratos CEO, flying. While black. Within a single afternoon, news outlets from Houston to New York picked up the story. By the next morning, major headlines plastered the internet. Stratos Air pilot under fire for discrimination. CEO Elena Brooks refused boarding by her own staff. Power, prejudice, and a public reckoning at Gate 07. In a quiet Manhattan conference room, Elena Brooks stood behind a podium facing a row of cameras. She wore the same calm expression she had held on the plane, only now the world was watching. She didn't read from a script. She didn't raise her voice, but every word was deliberate. What happened at Gate 07 was not a miscommunication. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a moment of bias, plain and simple. Stratos Air has always promised respect, safety, and inclusion. And that promise applies not just to customers with titles, but to everyone. Our leadership will not tolerate conduct that undermines those values, on the ground, in the air, or anywhere in between. Then, she stepped away from the microphones. She declined further questions. She didn't need to say more. Across the country, in a modest one-story home outside of Houston, Brent Wallace sat hunched on his living room couch, remote in hand, television blaring with the very press conference he had hoped would never happen. His wife stood in the kitchen, arms folded, watching silently. Elena's face filled the screen, composed, dignified, devastating. Brent's fingers twitched around the remote, but he couldn't bring himself to change the channel. The clips rolled in sequence, the original footage, interviews with passengers, reactions from aviation analysts, and then, finally, the statement from Stratos Air's executive team confirming that Brent had been relieved of duty pending formal investigation. His phone buzzed on the table. A message from an old colleague read, "You're on CNN, man. What happened?" Another from a junior pilot. "They're saying you got suspended. Tell me this is blown out of proportion?" But Brent had no answers, only silence, and the creeping realization that this wasn't blowing over. For most of his career, he had believed he could outfly controversy, that the cockpit was a place where judgment was clear, objective, and above politics. But now, stripped of the yoke, stripped of the uniform, he found himself at the mercy of a truth he could no longer rationalize away. He had drawn a line at Gate 07, and now the entire country had seen what stood on either side of it. One side was leadership, the other was him. The aftermath of Gate 07 didn't come with sirens or boardroom shouting. It came quietly, in inboxes, text messages, whispered conversations, and lingering looks exchanged in break rooms and hangars. What happened between Captain Brent Wallace and Elena Brooks was no longer just a moment. It had become a mirror. And across Stratos Air, people were staring into it. Some messages to Elena came from long-tenured staff. "We're proud of how you handled it. That could have been any one of us. Thank you for not sweeping it under the rug." Others were more cautious. "I worry this will divide the crew. Some of the older pilots are on edge. If we don't find a way to rebuild trust, we might lose more than one employee." Elena read every line. She responded to as many as she could. But one message, forwarded from HR, made her pause. It wasn't from a flight attendant or ground crew. It came from the pilots' union, a formal letter marked confidential. The message was brief, but the tone was clear. We do not condone Captain Wallace's conduct. However, we propose a structured, conditional path to limited reemployment for this case and for any future violations where true remorse and willingness to reform can be demonstrated. The letter went further. It outlined a system: mandatory diversity and de-escalation training, 1-year probation in a non-cockpit role, quarterly behavioral evaluations, no reinstatement of pilot privileges without executive clearance. To Elena, it was more than a policy suggestion. It was a question. Can justice coexist with redemption? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she called a meeting. That Friday afternoon, the executive conference room was filled with key leaders. David Tran, Chief Operating Officer; Marla Jensen, Head of Legal Affairs; Paula Simmons, the same operations manager who had relieved Brent at the gate; and a handful of directors from HR, flight operations, and ethics compliance. The conversation wasn't simple. Marla was firm. If we reverse course too quickly, it'll look like weakness. We set a precedent with this case. David leaned back in his chair. It's not about reversing anything. It's about setting the right long-term precedent, one that says we believe people can change, but not without earning it. Paula nodded slowly. I was there. Brent was out of line. But I also know what it means to lead a company where fear of punishment becomes greater than hope for growth. Elena listened more than she spoke. When she finally did, her voice was measured. This can't be about saving one man's job. It has to be about whether we believe the culture we're building includes a path forward for people willing to do the hard work of unlearning. There was no unanimous agreement. There rarely was. But when the meeting ended, she felt something stronger than consensus: clarity. Elena knew the final decision would rest on her shoulders, not just as CEO, but as the one who had stood on the receiving end of Brent Wallace's prejudice and still chose to lead, not to punish blindly. Outside, the evening sun had begun to fall behind the glass towers of Manhattan. The world kept turning, news cycles kept shifting. But inside Stratos Air, something deeper was underway, a reckoning not just with one man's bias, but with the company's soul. The question was no longer whether Brent Wallace would return. It was whether he truly wanted to become someone worth returning at all. 3 weeks had passed since Gate 007 became a national headline. And now, Brent Wallace stood in the lobby of Stratos Air's headquarters, noticeably thinner beneath a borrowed suit jacket. His once bright eyes were shadowed with fatigue, and the crispness that once defined him had dulled to a quiet stiffness, less authority, more survival. The receptionist offered him a seat. He declined. Instead, he stood near the frosted glass elevator doors, hands clenched at his sides, trying to slow his breathing. This wasn't a return to glory. This was a plea for mercy, wrapped in protocol. The elevator chimed. When the doors opened, Elena Brooks was already waiting. She hadn't brought an assistant. No aides, no audience, just her presence, measured, composed, and unmistakably in control. Brent swallowed hard. Ms. Brooks, he said, his voice gravelly. Elena nodded once. Captain Wallace. Then she paused. Or Brent, if you prefer. He managed a half nod, unsure whether to feel relieved or ashamed at the informality. She led him into a small conference room, glass walls, no table between them. A union rep waited outside, per Brent's request. But this part? This had to be face to face. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Brent cleared his throat. His voice wavered, not theatrical, not rehearsed, just raw. I've played that morning over in my head more times than I can count. The way I spoke to you, the way I looked at you. I told myself it was protocol, but it wasn't. Not really. Elena remained silent, eyes steady. I was angry about the promotion, about how fast the company was changing, and I let that anger take shape in your direction. He lowered his gaze. You didn't deserve that, and I'm sorry. There it was. No excuses, no framing, just an apology, delayed but unguarded. Elena exhaled slowly. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear but not cold. You made assumptions about me, about what I was doing there, and those assumptions nearly cost you everything. Brent nodded. They still might. She studied him, not to humiliate, but to weigh what remained. What she saw was not the same man from Gate 07, not the polished captain with clipped tone and straight lines. This man had folds, fractures, edges softened not by kindness but by consequence. Still, sincerity alone wasn't enough. "We're drafting a position," she said carefully. "It's non-flight, ground operations. You'd be under direct supervision on a probationary track. Diversity training, quarterly reviews, conflict mitigation work. Your pilot's license will remain inactive." Brent didn't flinch. "I understand." "This isn't reinstatement," she added. "It's accountability, with conditions." "It's more than I deserve," he replied quietly. Elena paused, letting that settle, then stood. "That will depend on what you choose to do with it." He rose as well. His movements were slow, deliberate. As he reached for the door, he turned back, just once. "Thank you for even meeting with me." Elena didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "Redemption doesn't start with forgiveness," she said. "It starts with reckoning. You've taken the first step. The rest? That's yours to walk." And with that, Brent exited the room. No applause, no promise of return, just a narrow, unlit hallway, and the quiet chance to earn his way forward. At 6:40 a.m., long before the first boarding call echoed through the terminal, Brent Wallace stepped onto the cold concrete of Hangar C, clipboard in hand. No wings on his chest, no title embroidered on his jacket, just a laminated badge marked Logistics Support, Restricted Access, and a rotating schedule pinned to the break room wall. His days now consisted of aircraft positioning reports, maintenance liaison forms, and verifying cargo weights. It was quiet work, unseen, but necessary. And for Brent, it was the first time in 2 decades that he'd clocked in without a cockpit. He worked under a younger supervisor, Amari Green, a rising operations manager with sharp instincts and no tolerance for ego. She didn't offer him sympathy, nor did she humiliate him. She simply gave him expectations, and then stepped back to see if he would meet them. And slowly he did. He arrived early. He asked questions. He stayed out of the spotlight. And when training modules were assigned, implicit bias, emotional intelligence, conflict recognition, he didn't scoff. He completed them quietly, notebook in hand, jaw clenched with the weight of introspection. Some colleagues whispered, others avoided eye contact, but a few, in time, nodded as they passed. Respect didn't return overnight, but neither did he expect it to. Across the country, Elena Brooks was moving with different speed. In the months following the Gate 07 incident, she commissioned a company-wide review of leadership culture at Stratos Air. What began as a reaction to a single moment evolved into a strategy for transformation. New protocols were implemented, conflict de-escalation training for all supervisory roles, zero-tolerance clauses tied directly to executive bonus structures, mandatory equity and inclusion seminars not as a checkbox but as part of promotion eligibility. And most notably, a revised code of conduct, anchored in 3 principles: respect, responsibility, repair. Elena didn't just want compliance, she wanted culture, and she began with the very symbol that launched the reckoning. Gate 07. Once just another boarding gate at Houston International, it had become something more. An internal campaign was quietly launched. New hires learned about the story, not as gossip, but as guidance. Training sessions referenced it by name, not to shame, but to shape. In time, Gate 07 became company shorthand for what not to ignore, for when to speak up, for how quickly a moment can define a legacy. One afternoon, Elena returned to Houston for an executive audit. Her visit was unannounced, as always. She wore no formal title tag, no security escort, just a pressed blazer and the same quiet strength she carried at Gate 07. She walked past it without stopping, but several employees did a double-take. A baggage handler nodded in recognition. A flight attendant glanced toward the gate, then back at her as if to say, "We remember." Elena didn't need to pause. The story had already taken root. As for Brent, he remained in his modest role. He no longer dreamt of returning to the skies. But he worked, he learned, and occasionally when passing through the terminal, he would catch sight of Gate 07. He never looked away, because that gate wasn't just where everything ended for him. It was where something began, for the company, for the culture, and for himself. Legacy, he'd come to understand, wasn't about command. It was about what you leave standing when your authority is stripped away. And in the quiet spaces of consequence, he finally began to build something worth keeping. What happened at Gate 07 wasn't just about one pilot's prejudice. It was about how power, when unchecked, can turn into arrogance, and how bias, even in silence, can shape decisions with devastating consequences. But perhaps more importantly, it showed us this. Leadership isn't about a title or a seat at the front of the plane. It's about how you respond when you're disrespected, how you carry yourself in the face of ignorance, and how you choose to build change, not with revenge, but with resolve. Elena Brooks didn't just correct a wrong, she used it to redefine a culture. And in doing so, she reminded us all, respect isn't earned by demanding it, it's earned by embodying it. If this story moved you or made you reflect, don't just scroll past. Like this video to support more stories that spark change. Comment below. What would you have done if you were in Elena's shoes? And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, real-world stories that challenge bias and uplift truth. This was more than a flight delay. It was a wake-up call. And we're just getting started.